Alright guys, we're finishing the setup here. Just give me a couple thumbs up and comments in the chat section. Let me know that you can hear me clearly before we get rolling. Alright, so what do you think of the new lighting setup here? We've gone a little blue in the background here. It's something we can change episode to episode just to jazz and change things up a little bit. Just give me a little bit of feedback just to make sure we know we got good sound. We're not having any issues on that front. Yes, this is Frank Perdomo. I'm with Power by the Hour Performance. If you're new to the show, thank you for joining us tonight. We cover a lot of different things and topics related to coyote swaps. I work here at Power by the Hour Performance. I'm one of the sales staff on site. We're located in West Palm Beach, Florida, right at the end of the airstrip here at Palm Beach International Airport. We do have a full catalog of coyote swap products, 6R80 transmission, 10R80 transmission products, and newly growing is the Godzilla swap section, which we've just added to the website. All there is a crate engine right now. We're yearly waiting control packs to come out for those, so easy on those questions for now. We are going to be covering a specific tech-related topic tonight, and the only reason we want to bring this up is because we get this question a lot when people call in having issues starting their vehicle. So we're going to cover some generic tech as it relates to getting your coyote swap to actually start via the provided control pack wiring. Some of the things you have to do to make sure it's going to work, what you have to wire up, some of the intricacies of two of the different combinations, whether it be a 6R80 or not, essentially a manual or an independently controlled automatic in that front, and what you have to do within the control pack guidelines to make those work. We're going to be covering Generation 1, Generation 2, Generation 3. For the most part, none of the stuff matters F-150 or Mustang, so we won't be mentioning that in particular, just if you have a 6R80 or 10R80, or manual other transmission, basically, as it applies. We want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. No matter where you're coming from, we'll go through a little roll call here in a second, but thank you for joining. We do ask you to please subscribe to the channel, but more importantly, hit that notification bell and hit all. That really helps our analytics and gets the channel basically broadcasted to more viewers and more people out there searching for some of the stuff that we have tagged. Coyote Swap Tech, F100 coyote swaps, Mustang coyote swaps, that kind of stuff. So to help us get out to more people other than just sharing the links that we put out on Facebook and our own website, make sure you hit notifications and then hit all after you subscribe. It really helps us out, and if you can do that, that'd be great. If you have any tech questions, try to hold on to them until after we go through some of the stuff we're going to cover here in this episode, and then we'll be able to hop into the chat room. If you got a question that you definitely have to get answered and you want to get it right up to the front, the super chat is available, and for a small donation to the channel, we'll go ahead and answer that question guaranteed. And honestly, most of the guys in the group can probably chime in as well with some of their comments and help you with some of the tech they've encountered. There's a great group of people that watch the show religiously and that are out there in the Coyote Swap forums and groups that can help you with tech as well. If you have any questions that you need to get answered, parts to order, we have pbhperformance.com. All of our product instructions are on there, including some tech articles. You can call us at 561-737-2331. That'll get you one of our sales staff Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. And we have three other guys available. You got me in particular, you got Travis Dean, you got Frank Pezzo, and you got Christian Papa. All accomplished, really well-rounded guys. And they can help you out with any tech questions you have, plus sales and anything along those lines. So with that all out of the way, we'll say hello to a few people and read through some of these comments. I know that, where'd he go? I know I had him. Wild Horse Garage was the first guy to post tonight. I don't know, on YouTube, it doesn't show up in the chat, but Wild Horse Garage, thanks for joining us, brother. You were first in line today. We got Robbo, bam, second. 2000 MCR saying hello. Thank you for joining us again, brother. Joe Lubner, Root Beer, Jordan Dunning, what's going on? Ike Hart, Jason Freeberg, Max Lubble. What's going on, everybody? David Martin, Raymond Santana, Parker's in the house. I don't know what brown chicken, brown cow means, but yes, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Kimbo Slice, Barry Farmer, Foxcast Media, Caleb. I just watched, if you guys don't know Caleb, Foxcast Media, he uses, and they do a lot of Coyote Swap and Coyote Swap coverage within their regular broadcast and their show. But he's got Jeremy Dover doing a lot of swaps up there in his area. He covers a lot of what they're doing. They use a lot of PBH product to get jobs done. And they just basically launched a video. They're doing a S197 swap. We did provide them one of our first S197 harnesses, and they're showing you step by step that installation, and we'll see how everything works out. It is still a test piece. It's not the final thing. It's not a manufacturer thing yet, but it is one of the final test ones we have out there before we finally put a part number on this thing and start ordering it and getting things manufactured. It's been a long time coming. Let's see here. Parker, yeah, Barry got Eric. Okay, so hello everybody. Thanks for joining us. Looks like we got about 36 people on right now. That's pretty cool. We're going to get right into our topic of the night, which is going to be how to wire an ignition, whether it be an ignition switch tumbler like what you would have in a traditional Fox body F100, or if you're using an engine start button, as it relates to control packs. Now we're going to cover the Ford Racing control packs and the PBH control pack that's available in body harness in Gen 1. Then we're going to cover Gen 2 and Gen 3, which is all Ford Racing as well. I got some schematics from the instructions from all of them. We can kind of go through it step by step. But generally, what we run into is we'll get somebody who has bought all these parts from us, or maybe they bought them from somewhere else and they just need help and they can't get the help anywhere else. We'll get the phone call, we'll get the email. I got everything hooked up. Everything's got power. It doesn't want to start. And when they say it doesn't want to start, it doesn't mean that it's cranking over and it won't fire. It's that the starter motor itself isn't engaging and turning over. And that's problematic, naturally, because, hey, that's how you start the vehicle, and that's how it's supposed to work. I follow the instructions. What did I do wrong? Well, the number one thing that we find is grounds. Grounds are vital. You can have a ton of issues with your control pack installation if you don't have it grounded properly. So please, pretty please, with sugar on top, make sure your engine block is properly grounded. If there's any question of mine if it's grounded, put a ground strap on it. If you've relocated the battery, make sure the battery is grounded to a nice thick piece of steel, metal, part of the chassis. Something hardcore. Floor pans, depending on what car you're in, may not be thick enough to actually properly ground the battery. You can end up with situations where you hear stuff click and nothing happens. Hear throttle bodies flutter, nothing happens. It's because there isn't sufficient power. The ground that you have isn't enough, and subsequently the PCM doesn't fire up, and all the fuses and relays are struggling to stay on. They're just clicking and rattling. So make sure that your grounds are hooked up. Now, there's several grounds in our body harness, and actually our body harness and the Ford Performance body harness as well. Please put those in the proper locations. We've had plenty of folks tell us, hey, nothing's happening, I got a problem, and they've either hooked a ground to power, and they're backfeeding the system, which is crazy, or they just forgot to hook them up. They just glazed over them. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't see in the instructions, whatever it is. If you see something that's not hooked up, ask somebody, because it may be important to what you're doing. In fact, you'll see in Generation 2 and Generation 3 of these control packs, there is a connector that you're going to snip off if you have an automatic 6R80 or a 10R80 transmission, depending on what generation you are. So if you don't see that in the instructions, you leave it there. You're going to be wondering what that connector is for. You could leave it in there, but whatever. We'll talk to you about that here in a second. So let's dig into Generation 1. And we already prefaced once that Mustang and F-150 doesn't matter in this case. So if you get a Mustang or an F-150 engine, powertrain, transmission, just get that out of your mind. That doesn't apply. There's two positions on your key tumbler or within your combination of switches. Your key tumbler, your ignition switch, as you have your key, you're going to have constant power going to it. Now, this is general ignition switch stuff. This isn't anything special or vehicle specific. You're going to have power constantly on it, right? You're going to have one position being run by the PCM. You do have the option to bypass the PCM altogether for both your fuel pump and your starter motor. If you feel like doing that, that's fine. Ignore what we're talking about here because it's not going to apply. You still are going to have to excite the PCM, though, because if the PCM doesn't have power, it doesn't work. So in that case, if you're going to go that route, before we get into all this stuff, all you would do is have your constant power to the ignition switch or a toggle switch for your ignition power, and then your start button goes directly to your starter. That's it. Or your start switch goes directly to your starter, and you bypass the PCM on those functions. You're going to wire your fuel pump to ignition power to trigger the relay, and you're done. But you do have the option, as Ford provides you in the control packs, and so does PBH, to do those both through the PCM. And that is basically how it's done from the factory. So we suggest using what's provided in the control packs, both from PBH and Ford Racing, and do it through the computer. There's really no advantage to doing it separately, unless you have a control panel where you're doing pump outs for fuels and more race car based stuff. 96% of you guys installing this stuff really don't need to go that far into the installation or have that need in particular. So we're going to go at this as if we're going to run everything through the control pack alone. So now we got that out of the way. Grounds, yes, you can wire it separately, it will work. But let's approach this as if we're using the control pack and how it's supplied. Generation 1, Generation 2, Generation 3. Another foundation tech basement level knowledge is that the 6R80 transmission in Generation 1 and 2, 10R80 in Generation 3, they have the neutral safety switch built into the transmission. So as long as your wiring is plugged in, you have a neutral safety switch. As long as it's in park, it starts. When it's a manual, you got a clutch switch for that. It's like a safety for you. So let's look at Generation 1, Ford Racing manual transmission. And this is what Ford Racing provides you in a control pack. And this is, for the most part, this is what you're generally getting, other than a few other pieces like the mass airflow meter, cold air kit, and so forth. This being the first control pack that ever came out for the Coyote engine is always a good place to start. 3 connectors on the PCM, 1 for body, 1 for engine, 1 for transmission. Ford Racing in Generation 1 intertwined the manual transmission harness and the body harness. So they're not separate like they would be in factory. That's going to be more important when we look at the PBH harness here in a second. This is what they explain as far as their blunt leads. Now, blunt leads are going to be the wires that you actually have to make connections on. They don't have a connector on the end. They're typically labeled. The color of the wire and the position of the wire is going to help you find out which one you're working with if for any reason that label fell off. And then Ford Racing does a nice job of outlining what you have to do. Now, the ignition switch is what we're looking at mainly here. We're going to be looking at B and C under section 8.2. Your blunt lead 2, pin number 5, ignition switch position, red, light, green, red and light green wire. There you go. Red with a light green tracer wire. They tell you you need to connect this wire to a single source on the ignition switch that provides 12 volts when the key is in the start position and the run position. Now, what that means for you is when your ignition switch goes to that first position and everything turns on, that's your start. That's basically your run position, so it's giving you power to everything in the system to energize things. Then you have the start request, which is the secondary position, which we'll cover in B. It is imperative that the circuit be reliable. The PCM will interpret any intermittent voltage on this signal as a request to shut down the engine. Hint, if your engine shuts down after a hard launch, check here first. So obviously, they got a few people calling them about that. But again, grounds are important, because if you don't have your wiring grounded or the fuse panel grounded and you lose power to the PCM, this is a good spot where you can run into issues or basically fire up and shut down, or maybe a PCM, weird drivability concerns because you have low voltage. But all you're doing here is hooking to that point on the ignition switch. Once you have your 12 volt constant to that and this wire, you can energize the entire system. Now the next step is hooking up the start request. Now this red and light blue wire, blunt lead number 3, pin number 3 on the connector, is to connect to a start node of the ignition switch, so that 12 volts is provided when engine starting is requested. Now on your starter solenoid, you're going to have a node, a little ear, that you would run the provided wire out of the harness, not direct from this point. From this point here, this blunt lead that they're talking about, that goes to the PCM. There's going to be another provided blunt lead that goes to that node typically with an eyelet on it. And you're going to secure it to the starter solenoid. Once you have that, the PCM is energized. It's going to fire up the fuel pump if you have it hooked up through the control pack, and then it'll tell the starter to go ahead and pulse. All this going through the PCM. Now, Fox body guys are used to having that starter solenoid, even more vintage vehicles, having that starter solenoid somewhere on the aprons. And I get asked all the time if they can bypass that. Yes, you can, but it's important that you know that a lot of the factory electronics are run through that junction point. So if you want to get rid of it, make sure you treat and properly readdress where the power is coming to for those circuits that are running off that starter solenoid. You don't want to kill them all. If there's anything related to the engine, typically it can go away. It's mainly going to be power source for the body and so forth. If you want to keep that in place, you can literally run from the blunt lead. There's a way to wire it up, but I would suggest just going straight to the PCM. I really don't like to subscribe to leaving that starter solenoid in play, because it's just one more failure point along the road. So you're going to run this wire from your ignition switch straight to the PCM as it's outlined in the control pack. The control pack then will send the signal down to the starter solenoid and fire it up. Does that make sense? Let's see here. I think everything makes sense. Anybody saying it doesn't make sense? So anyway, let's get back to our diagrams here. So yeah, that's going to give you your 2-wire hookup to your ignition switch. Now, if you have a start button, which a lot of guys have used, you can still use a key tumbler to give the run position onto the PCM, or use an ignition switch. Like in my car in particular, I have an ARC panel, and that ARC panel has 2 buttons on it. The first button is going to be to turn on the ignition. That's basically the run position. And then I have a starter momentary button that'll allow me to start the engine. So I turn on, fuel pump fires up, PCM's energized, you hear the butterfly in the throttle body jiggle a little bit, and then I hit my start button. Now that I know everything's fired up and I got fuel pressure, and then the computer tells the starter to run. So you can run them independently. There's 2 different ways of doing it. You can do as simple as 2 toggle switches. One of them has to be momentary for the start request, or you can use your ignition switch from your factory car or an aftermarket version of it. You can even hook this up to remote start, but it's very important that you have a neutral safety. And the neutral safety, again, like we outlined already, if it's a 6R80 with the PBH control pack, the computer already knows it handles all the neutral safety stuff, because the transmission needs to be in park to be able to start. If it's a manual, you're going to have to use a clutch switch. Now, I believe Ford Racing does give you a clutch switch in the Generation 1 manual control pack, and it's basically a bottom travel switch. So if you have a Fox body, a New Edge, an SN95 Mustang, something that had a neutral safety from the factory, you're basically going to replace that switch with the one that's provided and wire it in. It does have a connector provided. Now, do you have to use Ford Racing switch with their connector? No, you do not. If you want to basically just take the wiring that's going into the back of the Ford Racing connector and switch it out to what you had from the factory, so you don't have to install that switch, you can do that as well. But basically, it's always normally open, and when you close that circuit by depressing that switch, that's what tells the computer, hey, it's okay to go ahead and start. That way, if you don't have your foot on the clutch or on some sort of neutral safety switch, the vehicle will not start or will not run. So yeah, that's basically the connector face. So it shows you the power ground. It's basically on both of them, and it's sending a signal there from the PCM, and it's expecting you to close that circuit so it'll have power on the other side and make the signal to the PCM and make it basically allow it to start. Now, when we look at the the PBH control pack, or the body harness in particular, we have changed our system to allow you to run both manual or automatic. And when it's a manual, we do give you some blunt leads for a neutral safety switch. We don't include a switch. We just tell you that, hey, these wires here in particular are for a neutral safety. So if you're running a manual, you will use those in particular. If you're not running a manual and you have a 6R80, then you don't need to do anything. You just leave those wires there, you cap them off, and call it a day. Make sure they're safely secured. You can snip them, whatever, put some heat shrink on them, make sure they don't ground out or whatnot. you don't use them. They're in the blunt lead section of the harness. If it's a 6R80, that's what you're doing. If it's a manual, you're going to be using those wires on a neutral safety switch if you know what's good for you. I don't have one in my own personal race car. I really should, but it makes it easier if I'm trying to diagnose something, trying to let a car run while it's cooling down, stuff like that. Or warm up a car. I don't have to hop in over the roll bar to get to it. But if it's a street car, you should definitely have a neutral safety switch. That way you don't start the car in a parking lot and it runs off on you. I should do the same thing, but that's my own prerogative. Off-road only. So looking back at the PBH diagram for the ignition switch, this diagram, other than the colors of the wires, really tells the whole story for you. Now you can kind of omit the part that says upshift, downshift. That has to do with our select shift functions. We're just targeting your ignition switch itself, where we have the blue wire with white tracer and the yellow wire. So the ignition switch is going to have constant 12 volts. You're going to have the yellow wire to give power to the PCM and excite everything and turn it on and get it ready for you to go ahead and hit the start request. The start request is going to be the blue and white wire that goes directly to the PCM, and then through the wiring harness, there's an eyelet down by the transmission that goes to the starter solenoid, and you hook that up, and your starter circuit is done. I have had plenty of people accidentally hook that eyelet to ground because it is just a generic eyelet, and it looks like it would be a ground. But this is going to go to the starter solenoid node right on the starter solenoid. If you hook it to ground, you're going to be popping all sorts of relays and fuses in the fuse panel, and you won't start, and you could burn down the fuse box. So if it's down there by the transmission, it looks like an eyelet. Typically, there's no grounds down there. That's probably for your starter solenoid. A lot of people have run into that. Kimbo Slice, thank you. Thank you for your support. You're asking about any news for 05 GT swaps. The latest news is that Caleb from Foxcast Media has our harness and he's installing it. He's doing a little step-by-step there with Jeremy Dover. Be interesting to watch, and then we'll come out with some part numbers here shortly. All right, so when it comes to the PBH body harness for manual and automatic meaning the 6R80 in particular. If you don't have a 6R80, you're going to treat it like a manual or other transmission. As I've outlined before, when it comes to control packs, it's either 6R80, 10R80, or other transmission. When it's other transmission, then you're going to have to source those neutral safeties on your own. If it's a 4R70W, you're going to have to find the wiring coming out of the multifunction switch and maybe run the supplied manual transmission leads to those off the transmission itself, or come up with some other way of doing a neutral safety switch. It could just be a toggle switch on the dashboard in the center console, something like that. But you really want to have one just in case you go to fire it up one day and it's in gear, either embarrassing or potentially can crash the vehicle or maybe even hurt somebody. That's not good either. But as it's laid out on the screen here, this is a very generic way of looking at this. The colors of wires may change between Gen 1, Gen 2, and Gen 3, but what you're hooking up doesn't. You're going to turn on the car with key power, and you're going to request a start. If that doesn't make sense, let me know. Send me an email. If you can't get, if that doesn't make sense to you, then you may have some other issues going on. You need some further explanation. I know not everybody's a wiring genius. I know I'm not a wiring genius. I've learned through osmosis here. But you can email me, frank@pbhperformance.com. That's also a good email in case you want one of our PBH hats. I'm wearing one of the custom ones tonight. We have black and gray for our viewers. And if you would like one of those, send me an email. We'll send you a PayPal link. You can go ahead and order a hat. We'll get you taken care of. But yes, if you have any questions about what we're talking about here, you can post them up in the chat. I'll go over some of the stuff as we get along. If you post it now, I may not get to it. So Super Chat might be a good way to get it in front of me, or wait till we're done with this topic in particular. So let's look at Gen 2. Gen 2, Ford Racing came out with a body harness. Now they have two different control packs, one for 6R80 and one for all other transmissions, manuals, automatics that are independently controlled together. But the body harness is the same. So that means there's one body harness for both 6R80 and manual other transmission. So basically one body harness covers them all. And the first thing they tell you in the instructions is that there is a connector that you're going to snip off if you're not using it as a manual or independently controlled transmission. And then you want to seal those wires up so they don't have any potential issues down the road and continue. That's if you have a 6R80. If you got anything other than a 6R80, this is what you're looking at. You've got under 6.2.2 blunt lead number 3. They tell you starter motor request, light blue wire. Now that light blue wire is basically going to your key tumbler in the start request position. So this is the position you're going to when you're actually trying to start the vehicle. You have a couple other blunt leads, and you got blunt lead number 5 under 6.2.4, ignition relay trigger. This is a light green wire. Now the light green wire, they lay out a little bit too much information. It kind of gets a little confusing for everybody. I already said, yeah, you can have a key tumbler or you can have an ignition switch. They're using the example of having 2 toggle switches to mimic basic switches so you don't have a key. So it'd be like a race car instead of you having a traditional key tumbler to start the vehicle. So they tell you setup A, connect this wire to the output side of the ignition toggle switch so that 12 volts is provided when the key is in the start cranking and run positions. It is imperative that the circuit be reliable. The PCM will interpret an intermittent voltage. This is the same message as Gen 1. Intermittent voltage is a signal request to shut down the engine. Hint, if your engine shuts down after a hard launch, check this first. Again, this is the same message they told us in Gen 1 instructions. That basically, yes, solid ground, solid power on the ignition switch, and make sure your ignition switch isn't janky, falling apart, loose connections, bad eyelets, that kind of stuff. Then they got setup B, which is connect the start run output node of the ignition cylinder so that as 12 volts is provided when the engine starting is requested. And then the same stuff below. Now down at the bottom is the important note. This kit includes connections and installation instructions for PCM controlled engine starting. However, it is not required that the customer utilize this option. Customers may choose to use their existing non-PCM controlled starting system if desired. If non-PCM controlled starting is used, step 6.2.2 may be omitted, and any unused blunt leads should be cut to 2 inches of length and sealed using heat shrink. That makes sense? Right. So if you have your existing starting system and you don't want to mess with it, you don't want the computer handling the starting, maybe you don't want the fuel pump triggered from the PCM, you can omit these steps here in particular and wire direct to those functions. But the PCM does need to be on. It has to be on. Bar none. If you got a guy who has a 6R80, you're doing an installation, you can't get it fired up, and man, I already set the shifter to park. One of the things we'll ask you to do is go ahead and jump the starter and see if it fires up. If it fires up, the vehicle thinks it's in first gear, second gear, park. It's in reverse, neutral drive, sport mode. It's not all the way in park. And then you'll have to disconnect your starter cable and push it up there. If you have a manual, then you're going to want to be jumping those wires to test it and see why it's not working, if you can start it independently. But you do have the option to wire it up independently. I'd rather you use the control pack PCM and what's outlined. It's more factory at that point. So going back to some of their instructions here, you got a light blue wire in Gen 2 for the starter motor request in the start position. You got a light green wire that's going to be exciting the PCM, turning all the power on in the fuse panel and telling things to turn on that we're ready to roll. The other thing you're going to have is constant power to your ignition switch or your buttons, whatever you're using in that case. We'll show you that here. They do provide a plunger style bottom travel clutch pedal position switch. This is for manual or maybe even the automatic cars. If you want to put it on your brake light switch, so you have to hit the brakes to fire the vehicle up, that's another option. They tell you, note, the clutch switch is intended for manual transmission use only. For automatic transmission, please cut off the CVT connectors Charlie 257 and seal the wires. Refer to section 4.4 for more detail. The switch translates the clutch pedal position to the PCM. Bottom travel switch also acts as a starter safety interlock. The starter motor will not energize until the clutch switch has been fully depressed. CVT switch is normally open, closed with clutch pedal fully depressed. Clutch pedal assembly, they give you the part number to it, is available through authorized Ford parts dealers. It includes clutch pedal and mounting bracket with provisions to hold both the top and bottom travel switches in the appropriate locations. They also give you a warning. Do not bypass the starter interlock. Doing so creates a hazard to those in and around the vehicle, as the starter can operate with the transmission in gear and the clutch pedal engaged. Yeah, that is true. I make this mistake every once in a while. I leave my car in gear. I don't know if it's in gear. I go to bump the starter and it moves. I got to hop in there and take it out of gear. It's not safe. So definitely consider not bypassing it. So looking at the next diagram, they show you their blunt leads for Generation 2. Now again, this is for both 6R, basically all transmissions. This is going to cover the whole base. This is a 16-pin pigtail. And if you look at the cavities, you got your fuel pump relay out, starter motor request, light blue wire. You got ignition relay trigger, light green wire. Those are the same two wires we just covered in the other diagram. They're just showing you where they are on the connector, because this connector can be disconnected from the fuse panel or the wiring harness. And it has all your blunt leads on it. So if you need to do some work on it and maybe delete some stuff, move some stuff, extend it, you can actually disconnect it and work safer as if versus having it installed in the vehicle. This is back to the beginning. So yes, this is what you're looking at. Light blue, start request. Light green, 12-volt power to the PCM. Does that all make sense? Let's see here. Now, I'm seeing a few questions as far as Gen 2 or S197. This is mainly we're going to be answering questions about what we're talking about right now. We'll try to cover that stuff in a little bit if you have some other tech questions. Coffee break. As far as wire size, you don't need heavy gauge wire here. This is just sending a 12-volt signal. The heavier gauge wire is going to be the 12 volts being supplied to the ignition switch. Like in a Fox body, it's that thick yellow wire, so it's a bigger gauge. This stuff here is all very small gauge because it's just communicating. The main power is coming out of the fuse panel itself, where there's thicker gauge wire. This is all triggers. You don't have to worry about having heavy gauge wire coming off your ignition switch to the PCM. In fact, Ford and PBH provide that thinner gauge wire for you to hook it up. So you typically don't have to worry about adding anything there. Wild Horse Garage says it makes perfect sense. So we'll keep moving along here. Let's look at Generation 3. Now this one is a little trickier because Ford works in some stuff to their instructions that have to do with the fuel pump. And it can throw you off if you don't read through it and understand what they're talking about here. So let's just dive right in and take a look at it. So this is Generation 3. They show you a 6-way pigtail. Now this pigtail, they show at the top, it is a loose pigtail that connects to the body harness in a designated area. The 6-way pigtail is to be connected according to the chart below. See also the diagrams on the following pages for illustrations on wire connection points. Based on the ignition starter switches that you intend to use, setup A uses separate toggle switches for ignition starter inputs, and setup B uses ignition cylinder with a key. So we'll look at those diagrams here in a second. Now it's a 6-pin connector. There's only 3 wires in it that are actively being used. There's a fuel pump relay out, which is a ground. And then there's that is a trigger power. That is a ground. I believe it is a ground. Starter motor request, which is light blue. Apply 12 volts to send requests to the PCM to energize the starter solenoid. Same thing as we had in Generation 2, basically. Light green, which is your ignition on. Light green is going to be your apply. It's 12 volts to energize ignition relay, wake up the whole system. So they go on to explain to locate the blunt leads and hook them up. They have some diagrams for you to look at next. Now they show you in 6.2.1, blunt lead number 1, fuel pump relay out. That's the dark green wire. Connect to fuel pump positive. Separate ground for the fuel pump must be provided. The fuel pump will start running anytime the key is on. Then if you don't have the engine, start the engine, the computer will turn it off after a couple seconds. So they're basically going to the fuel pump relay, not the fuel pump itself, the fuel pump relay. That way it can trigger the relay to start. So there must be something going on in the Generation 3 computers where they don't have a fuel pump trigger coming right out of the PCM. They're basically jumping it off of this connector here. Now, it doesn't really have anything to do with the ignition switch. They're just using this position on the body harness to get this done. It doesn't have to do with your ignition switch whatsoever. So all that stuff we just covered, if you just zero in on your ignition switch and getting your starter work, has nothing to do with it. But it is there, so we have to address it. So let's take another look at it here. You got blunt lead number 3, which is starter motor request. That's a light blue wire. Now they go into the setups. Now in your setups, let's see if we can hop in there. This is setup B for a 10R80. Now what they show you here is a battery. You got positive, power, and ground. Positive goes to your ignition switch. That's your constant power. And then you got ground. And they show the ground going to the fuel pump relay, which again, really doesn't have anything to do with the starter system, that circuit on its own. But it's sharing this connector, so they have to put it in that picture. And then they show that green wire coming out and going to the fuel pump relay. Then we look at the ignition switch at the top of the screen there. And you have the 2 positions. Basically the position to turn everything on and wake it up. And then you have the start request position, which is where you're actually trying to turn the vehicle on. You got the light blue wire going to the start request, and then you got the green wire going to your wake up position. Then you have another option, which is with 2 toggle switches. Now this is to be an example of an ignition switch and a starter button. So if you have an ARC panel, it can be programmed for different things. Your starter button, your starter request needs to be momentary. The ignition switch needs to be on-off all the time. So at the top, they're showing you your ignition toggle switch. That's the on-off. And then you got the starter momentary switch for start request. Again, you got a power, constant power to both switches on one pole. And then you got your blue wire and green wire going to them. Corresponding positions and switches for either the wake up position or your start request. Again, none of this shit will work unless you properly ground your battery and your wiring harness and your engine and power it properly. In all these layouts, your starter motor is going to get direct power from the battery. So you have a power cable coming from the battery right to the starter motor. It's getting constant, big gauge power. It's ready to go at all times. So those poles are hot. The only other thing that you're connecting to it is going to be your node, and sometimes a ground. But the node itself to the solenoid is what's key. Gotcha. Now that's coming out of your harnesses. You don't have to provide that wire. It's in the harnesses already, in your transmission harness, down by the O2 sensors and stuff like that. So, looking at setup A, 2 switches makes perfect sense. They kind of simplify it for you there. They show it with toggle switches. You don't have to use toggle switches. There's a bunch of different switches out there in the world that you can use. They're just using toggle switches. I think it's probably a little bit simpler to show exactly what's going on. Now they also include a neutral safety switch. Same thing goes. If it's a 10R80 or you have an automatic transmission that has a built-in neutral safety, well actually let's just say 10R80 only. You're cutting that back and heat shrinking it because you're not going to use it. If it's a manual or any other transmission, you have the option to use those wires as a neutral safety so that you can have it safely wired up. This is a bottom travel switch, plunger style. It's normally open. You have to close the contact to go ahead and send the signal to the PCM so it knows that your foot is on the clutch or you have some sort of safety engaged, and then it'll turn the starter on. This is to give you a chance to make sure the vehicle's in park or is in neutral before you start the vehicle up. And of course they have some other information there. Now, all these screenshots are directly from the Ford Performance instruction manual, so you can go hop online and look at them. We also have them listed on the products on our website as well. And there was one, we'll look at blunt lead number 5. Blunt lead number 5, which is your light green. This is the ignition on wire, which we just showed you setup A and setup B. And then you have your light blue wire for start request. You wouldn't believe how many people hit us up asking questions about this in particular, and it's driving them nuts. And they have to step back from it, take a deep breath, hear from somebody else, and try to get it fixed. It's not the easiest thing to tech over the phone because there are so many things that can affect it, especially when there's a 6R80 or a 10R80 transmission involved, and then there's adjustment on the shifter cable. what we would suggest is just grab the shift lever and put it in the park position. Have that set up manually before you adjust it when you first want to fire it up and check things. Then hook up and adjust your shifter cable, because at that point you already know that the vehicle is wired properly and it's running, it's not leaking anything. Then you can hook things up, adjust it, and start using the actual shifter to go ahead and get things moving down the road. Let's hop into the chat room here, see where we're at. See if there's any questions. Any questions? Make perfect sense. Max Level, from what I understand, once the fuel pump is primed, it'll send 12-volt signal to the solenoid starter. No. I don't think it works like that. Now, it may work like that from the factory, but really what they're doing there, they're just using the connector coming out of the body harness as a point to supply power to the fuel pump relay. So it really doesn't have much to do with the ignition switch, but it will time it out basically if you don't fire it up in a certain amount of time. But it's not really sharing, it's not really seeing the, actually it's no fuel pressure, there's no fuel pressure sensor. So it doesn't see fuel pressure. So it doesn't know it's prime. It does have a timer. So yes, in a way, Max, you are correct. Absolutely. How close is PBH to completing the Supercharged 99 video? We are still working on it. I got news that we get our drive shaft tomorrow, so we'll be able to finish filming and then finish the final edit cuts, and we'll have it out in probably a week or so after that. Let's see here. AG Foxbody 88 on a Gen 1 from F-150. I connected the safety switch cable to a ground. Let me think about that. On a Gen 1 from an F-150. Is it automatic or manual? Foxbody 88 connected the safety switch cable to a ground. Well, if you're bypassing it, that might be all you need to do to complete that circuit, basically. Ryan Merrill says he actually enjoys wiring. He's probably a low percentage guy on that one. Let's see, what else did I miss in here? Wild Horse Garage says he loves the blue. Thank you so much. Hopefully the camera's not freaking out with that blue background. It's a little bit darker in here right now. We're gonna add some more lights to try to make it look a little bit better in here. Make it look real snazzy, like my mustache. Eric Schraven, what's going on, man? Thanks for joining us. All right, Lorenzo Enzo has a question there. He says, what about adding remote start? Well, remote start, depending on how they provide it, typically will have provisions to go to your neutral safety switch. That way you don't start a vehicle remotely and it just takes off on somebody. So the neutral safety switch is still part of it. Now, if it's automatic, it's that much easier because the neutral safety switch is putting the transmission in park. It's the only way it's going to start. So all you're doing is requesting the ignition to turn on remotely and then trigger the starter wire. So you're going to be using those same two wires or tapping into them to go ahead and fire the vehicle up remotely with the module that's supplied by the alarm company, whoever's designing that kit. When it's manual, you have to work in that neutral safety. So how do you know it's in neutral if you're not in the vehicle depressing the clutch switch? That's typically why you don't have remote start on manual transmission cars. You could work a way around it, but there is no gear lever sensor on TKOs and T56s and T5s and stuff like that. So if you wire it up, it's at your own discretion, and you got to make sure the vehicle is always in neutral if you go to use it. Hopefully you have an automatic and it's a lot easier. Rob says to bust out the stripper pole. I don't think we'll ever get to that point, Rob. That might be a new level of desperation for me to actually have to get to that. But I can understand the desire. Ozzy says Gen 2 engine out of stock or moving on. It'll be just a Gen 3. Website says error Gen 2. Well, Gen 2 engines are always going to show that they're out of stock because we build them to order. So we have them. I've got 12 Gen 2 engines in process in the back. There is no sign that they are going to run out of them anytime soon. So we still have them. There is no warning going out. As soon as we know that there's low stock from Ford factory, we'll let everyone know and say, hey guys, prepare yourselves. It's Gen 3 time all the way if you're going brand new. Let's see here. Okay, AG Fox Body, he clarifies. He hooked his safety switch cable to a ground just to start the engine. Yeah, if you have the engine out of the car and you're just firing up like a crank a pallet or something like that, you can do some bypass stuff because it's not like it's going to launch itself through a garage door or into a parking lot or through a church, that kind of stuff. So you don't have to worry about that. But if you're just trying to test the engine, let's say you bought a used one, you want to make sure it doesn't tick, rattle, fall apart as soon as it then you can do that as well. You can just ground it, just get the power and the grounds that are necessary to do it, and rock and roll. Ozzy 1986, you're welcome, brother. Thank you for joining us. I know it's not the hottest of topics, it's not the sexiest of topics, but this is something that we get questioned all the time. And grounds and power connections are the number one culprit to issues. There is always the rare occurrence where Ford has the wires backwards. There's a bad pin, something like that. But typically, if you have a problem, before you call anyone, before you do anything, look at your grounds and make sure everything's hooked up. Every single eyelet on the engine harness or the body harness has a home. It could be a signal, it could be a ground, it could be a power. Make sure you know where everything's going and that it has a secure connection. No painted surfaces, no thin surfaces if you're talking about grounds. If the battery's in the trunk of a Mustang, remember the floorboards are kind of thin, so it may not have a good connection. If you through bolt it, make sure you grind off the paint and it's not oxidized from sitting there. You disconnected it one day, it rained, now it's all full of rust. You got to clean that stuff up. And when you do make the connection, try to seal it with some sort of a solvent, protective lubricant or paint or something to make sure that that raw connection is there and it's solid. Let's see here. Erwin Lopez, could the Ford IDS diagnostic tool be used to check any codes, check computer PIDs? Absolutely. Absolutely, without a doubt. You can use the IDS on control packs, especially ours because we have a VIN number and everything. But you can use the IDS tool to diagnose. The nice thing about control packs and even our body harness, we all use factory wiring. So factory wire colors correspond to the workshop manual as it relates to diagnosis. Wallhorse Garage, so you want your fuel pump circuit, starter circuit, non-PCM controlled. It's not a problem, correct? Just a matter of cutting and weatherproofing the associated wires. Let me read that back again because I think I read that too quick for me to even understand. So you want your fuel pump circuit, starter circuit, non-PCM controlled. It's not a problem, correct? Yes. If you don't want the starter request and the fuel pump circuit in the PCM controls, you can wire them independently. It won't cause any issues. You just ignore those blunt leads in the control pack and secure them safely. Correct. Just a matter of cutting and weatherproofing the associated wires. Yes, you are correct, Wild's Garage. That is how you would do it. Then you can wire those up independently. So if you had some sort of a racing starter box that has fuel pump and ignition and starter, you can wire that stuff up direct to your fuel pump. That's helpful when you have pump outs going on. If guys are drag racing and they're running some sort of a series, a lot of times I'll ask for fuel samples and stuff like that. That's where the pump out's really important. Maybe you don't want to store your vehicle with E85 in it. You want to put 93 in it. Then it makes it a lot easier to pump the fuel out, those kind of things. If you do it through the computer, then you got to ask for a pump out tune sometimes on the newer cars. In this case, most of the control packs do just supply a 12-volt constant once you get the vehicle running. So don't have to worry about that. Lorenzo Enzo, I thought I caught hell rewiring a dirt bike, but I like a challenge and definitely a 6R80. Honestly, guys, I did my car. I didn't do an awesome job. I almost feel like redoing my wiring because I understand it more now. Like I think I can do a lot cleaner job. But if I can do it, any of you can do it. I am not a master mechanic. I am not a master tech. I'm learning the same way you're learning, asking questions and talking to really, really good-looking guys. Right? No, talking to really smart people in the industry. I always say I learned by osmosis. I'm surrounded by really, really smart guys that know what they're doing, that know how general systems work. Because really, this is general electronics mixed into a little bit of high-end electronics from the factory. Now, we're not going to get into how the computer does all this stuff because I don't care. I don't care. All I need to tell the computer is what to do, and it's already programmed to do what needs to happen. So don't worry about all the crazy connections and 64-pin connectors of the PCM. You got 2 blunt leads that matter at the ignition switch or ignition buttons and your triggers. Those blue and green wires. What we have is yellow and blue, a white tracer. Whatever corresponds in your instructions. That's all you got to worry about. And then hooking it up to the starter properly. Making sure your battery's grounded. Making sure your engine's grounded. Your wiring harness is grounded properly. Remember, your wiring harness is getting a ground typically from the battery and power from the battery. So if the battery's not properly grounded, what happens? Everything trickles down and affects all the systems. So number one reasons we get calls for control packs. I'm having problems. I can't figure it out. It's this right here. Oh, my good friend Craig is here. Craig says, wiring is not sexy, but you are. Great job, Frank. Well, Craig, thank you very much. I've driven Craig's previous car. He had a Terminator. He's one of the guys that I learned a lot of driver's ed, driver's education, driving skills from. He's one of the guys that made sure I was always having a good time when we go out there. We had a good clan of guys who would go to events all the time. A blast, and we've become really good friends because of that. And he had a Terminator that was just wild to drive. Had like 480 horsepower. Had all the tricks done to it. It was gutted, roll cage. Was awesome. Really fun car to drive. Now he's got a GT350, and I can't wait to drive that. I might even try to get him into my car and see what he thinks of that thing. Maybe. We'll do a driver's ed day. He just got back from Roebling Road. Pretty cool. Love Savannah. Good beer there. Let's see here. Brett Caspers. Do you know if anyone has used a rotary dial gear shifter with a Gen 3 controls pack or an N10 R80? That's a good question, man. I'm gonna write that one down. That's that dial that Ford has from the factory. Let's see here. 10R80 gear dial. Control pack. Now, what that is going to be dependent on is CAN bus, because remember, you don't have the body control module. So if that switch goes to the body control module, and it's like, let's say, cruise control buttons, where it's not necessarily a wire for each position, but a resistance, it's going to be problematic to try to get to work. If we look at that dial, and all it is this wire for park, this wire for reverse, this wire for neutral, and those are available on the connector at the PCM, we're in business. But if it has 2 wires coming out of it, and they go to a body control module, we're in trouble. So we got to look at that and see if we can do that dial, because that'd be interesting. That'll actually be a neat thing. I wonder, but wait a minute, how does the shifter cable work? I got to look into that. I haven't looked into that at all. Thank you for bringing that up. That'd be an interesting conversation for one of the shows if we figure it out for next week. That's going to be a good one there. I'm going to write that one down. AG Foxbody 88, do I have to remove the oil cooler on a Gen 1 F-150? There's an adapter I can use. You can use an adapter to eliminate it. You don't have to eliminate it. Typically, it does get eliminated because it's just bulky and gets in the way of a lot of stuff. And if you want an oil cooler, it's a little bit easier to put an oil cooler up near the radiator, traditional style, and then plumb it to an adapter. They sell sandwich adapters. If the simple way to get rid of it is just by getting the oil stud from a Mustang, where it doesn't have that oil cooler, and you replace that stud. There's a long one there from the factory that the oil cooler goes over, then the oil filter kind of goes on the outer edge of it. You remove that, put in the short one, just run the oil filter up to it. If at that point you want to do a remote oil cooler, you can get a sandwich adapter that goes between the oil filter and the oil housing without the oil cooler in the way, or you can get a block adapter and run from there to an oil cooler and they get a remote oil filter. Depending on your room constraints and what you want to have as far as serviceability, one or the other might be better. Just got to figure it out based on your project. Yeah, Max Lovell mentioned exactly what I was talking about. There's a nipple. I think it's like $8 or $9. It's just a double threaded end. They're pretty much the same Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3. Same with oil filter housings and stuff like that as well. But yeah. So, wow, we covered a lot of information. It's already 7:55. If any of you guys had any questions that I might have missed, please email me. Down below is my email. It's my direct email, frank@pbhperformance.com. Also, if you guys have any topics that you want covered on the next show, email me. Let me know. Comment on this video. In fact, in this video, in the comment section, put topics that you want me to cover for the next show. I always struggle to come up with them, and I seem to just kind of go to the tech questions that we had that week and cover them as much as we can. That gear knob thing for the 10R80, that's going to be an interesting one. I'm going to study that the next day or two. We're probably going to be busy tomorrow once we get that drive shaft here to try to get that yellow 99 supercharged Coyote Swap up and running, because it's just about there. So probably we're going to be making some noise out of it come probably Friday, hopefully, and maybe even get on the dyno next week. Who knows? Max Level says Fuel Pump. Fuel Pump Frank. Is that my new nickname? Fuel Pump Frank? Are we having a nickname contest now? I got Ron Burgundy and Sex Panther and all that stuff going already. But thank you guys for joining me tonight. I know again tonight's topic wasn't the sexiest of topics out there, but it is something that we all had to encounter and do. And again, you have so many people in the industry in our groups that have done this already. There's a lot of information there to lean on now. Not everybody remembers what they did. Maybe they got lucky and got hooked it up. But a lot of the guys are out there to help you. We're there as well. Email us, info@pbhperformance.com, frank@pbhperformance.com. You got the Ford Performance Tech Hotline. They're still there. They do their chat. They're working remotely. Hopefully they'll be back in the office pretty soon. I don't know what's going on in Michigan there. We haven't left the office since all this COVID stuff went down. Okay, Max, we'll cover some fuel system stuff next week and talk about that real quick. Thank you. Fire Suit Frank. There it is. 2000 MCR chiming in. Again, if I missed anything for you guys, email me, call us, 561-737-2331. We got a bunch of smart guys on the phones. Email Frank, info@pbhperformance.com. If you want a hat, frank@pbhperformance.com. They're $25, including shipping. I'm waiting on some new hat stuff to come through as a test. It's kind of failing right now, so I don't know if it's going to be a good change to go to. We have t-shirts on the website. We got banners on the website as well. We're going to be adding some windshield stickers, banners, and our little quarter window stickers as well to the website tomorrow. So you can pick up all that stuff right at pbhperformance.com along with all of our products. We just updated our Gen 2 engine listing. It now has options for control packs, accessory drives, all those things that you can add on to it. If you're looking for a supercharge or NA powertrain, contact us. We can put them together still as a Gen 2. There are Gen 3 part numbers right from Ford Performance, which are a blast of a deal. But we can build you a custom powertrain, 6R80 or manual, mainly a TP6 Magnum, NA or supercharged, all the way up to about 800 horsepower. One fell swoop. One lump sum, shows up at your house, everything you need. Fuel system, cooling system, tuning, cold air kits, the works. We got you. And we got some trick cold air kit stuff coming out very soon. We got a couple other things on the back burner there. I can't wait to announce them, but they're just not there yet. So thank you again, guys, for joining us tonight. We'll be back Wednesday night, 7 o'clock Eastern, PBH Performance YouTube. Powered by the Hour Performance, thanks you for your support, and thank you for joining us. This outro has gone on way too long. Thank you again for your support. We will see you next week, and thank you all for the comments. Have a good one.